Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta sesión presidencial del ASA 2026. Mi nombre es Juan Pablo Luna y es un privilegio presidir esta conversación. No la ASA que lo preside Max Cameron y es a quien le debo el honor de estar sentado acá. El título de nuestra sesión es Democracias violentas y es un título deliberadamente incómodo. Nombra una condición que una generación anterior de latinoamericanistas trató como transitoria, como excepcional, como residual. Y sin embargo, hoy lo que vemos es la persistencia y en muchos lugares la profundización de la violencia a gran escala dentro de regímenes formalmente democráticos. 3 o 4 décadas después de la llamada tercera ola, esa condición ya no es, por lo tanto, ni transitoria ni excepcional, sino que es el contexto en el que vive, vota, se organiza y sobrevive una parte significativa de los ciudadanos y ciudadanas de la región. Esta sesión toma como punto de partida un dossier reciente del LASA Forum que editamos el año pasado sobre democracias violentas. Es el volumen 56, número 3, por si tienen ganas de revisarlo después de esta sesión. Hay varios autores de contribuciones a ese dossier que están acá sentados hoy. A quienes obviamente también quiero agradecer por su contribución a una conversación que lo que quiere hacer es abrir y tensionar la discusión más que clausurarla. Les he pedido a los panelistas que hoy me acompañan en esta mesa que miren hacia adelante y que sean, si lo desean, provocadores. Planteamos básicamente 3 preguntas para guiar esta conversación. ¿Qué deberíamos estar investigando y qué debería preocuparnos como campo en la próxima década, pensando en este problema de la interacción entre regímenes electorales y violencia? Y el panel es explícitamente interdisciplinario en el sentido de que también queremos pensar esto desde las distintas disciplinas, o por lo menos algunas de las disciplinas que estructuran y hacen parte de las. Segundo, cómo producimos conocimiento y conocimiento que nos exige la realidad que vive la región hoy, en términos de los fenómenos que tienen que ver con distintos tipos de violencia. Eso también implica, digamos, qué hacemos en términos metodológicos, cómo colaboramos entre colegas, con qué desafíos éticos y a qué costo eventualmente para las personas cuyas vidas estudiamos y sobre las cuales luego hacemos investigación. Y tercero, pero relacionado con lo anterior, ¿qué significa hoy estudiar estas democracias violentas si es que el subcampo, digamos, tiene sentido pensarlo de esa manera? Y es un subcampo que ha crecido sustancialmente en visibilidad e influencia en la última década. Cada panelista hablará por unos 10 minutos y luego tendremos un intercambio cruzado donde básicamente tendrán 5 minutos para luego, ojalá, abrir el espacio mayor posible a preguntas de la audiencia y a un diálogo con la audiencia que es lo que queremos aprovechar teniéndolos a todos ustedes aquí. Voy a controlar el tiempo de forma democráticamente violenta. Eso ya lo saben, digamos, los panelistas. Porque justamente queremos que la conversación luego dé paso a un intercambio con todas y todos. Presento ahora a nuestros 4 colegas, que son quienes tienen la responsabilidad por llevar adelante el panel, en el orden en el que intervendrán. Verónica Zubillaga es profesora titular de Ciencias Sociales en la Universidad Simón Bolívar en Caracas. Es profesora visitante en la Universidad de Illinois en Chicago. Y está en transición, entiendo, a Tulane University en estos días. Es también cofundadora de la Red de Activismo e Investigación por la Convivencia. Es una investigación sobre violencia letal, masculinidades y respuestas ciudadanas a la militarización policial en Venezuela. Ha fijado un estándar para entender cómo puede hacerse investigación comprometida y éticamente fundada sobre la violencia en Latinoamérica contemporánea y en un régimen que dejó de ser democrático hace ya bastante tiempo. Desmond Arias, a mi derecha, es el Mark Chair of Western Hemispherian Affairs en la Escuela de Políticas Públicas y Estudios Internacionales en CUNY. Es a quien le debemos esta noción de pluralismo violento, democracia violenta, en un libro que editó hace ya unos años. Y ha contribuido de forma seminal al estudio de la gobernanza criminal, desde su primera contribución, Drugs and Democracy en Río de Janeiro, hasta los estudios comparados que ha realizado últimamente en distintos países de América Latina y el Caribe. Shannon Matiache, también a mi izquierda, es profesora de Ciencia Política y Estudios Internacionales en Allegheny College. Su trabajo sobre política indígena, autonomía y políticas de seguridad en México, incluyendo investigación reciente sobre autodefensas y gobernanza comunitaria, trae a esta conversación un conjunto de casos y actores que el debate regional suele tratar como periférico, como excepciones, y que aportan luz en este túnel oscuro en el que muchas veces sentimos estar, y por lo tanto son también parte central del debate que queremos tener en esta mesa. Y finalmente, last but not least, Javier Aullero es Joe Long Chair in Democratic Studies y profesor de Sociología en la Universidad de Texas en Austin, y durante más de 2 décadas su trabajo etnográfico ha formado y transformado nuestra manera de pensar cómo se vive cotidianamente la pobreza, la violencia, la relación con el Estado y con la política en los márgenes de las democracias latinoamericanas. Verónica, Desmond, Shannon y Javier, gracias por haber aceptado esta invitación. Espero que nos encandilen mucho con las luces que nos están matando un poco acá adelante, y les dejo el espacio a ustedes para seguir adelante con la presentación.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Juan Pablo, por esta invitación para compartir aquí este panel estelar. En virtud de la invitación de pensar en preguntas y en agendas futuras, y sabiendo que voy a compartir el panel con ustedes, yo que quise organizar mi conversación, mi presentación, en 3 grupos de preguntas, ¿no? La primera parte de la constatación de que estamos en un mundo turbulento, de expansión de autoritarismos de izquierdas y derecha, y la regresión a una forma de imperialismo crudo, y lo hablo desde la posición de ser venezolana. Entonces creo que un grupo de preguntas tiene que ver con el impacto en la vida cotidiana de esta invasión violenta de los Estados Unidos a países como Venezuela, pero también la amenaza a países como Cuba, y cómo esta invasión y esta amenaza de invasión va a reconfigurar a los grupos criminales y a la criminalidad en la región. Y quisiera desarrollar este primer grupo de preguntas partiendo del hecho que nos encontramos en un momento de esta ambición imperial renovada, con una recuperación en pleno siglo XXI de la doctrina Monroe, con una recuperación de la doctrina de seguridad nacional y la creación de categorías como narcoterrorismo para justificar este tipo de invasiones. Este tipo de categorías, donde por ejemplo grupos como el grupo venezolano como el Tren de Aragua, pasa a ser definido como una amenaza terrorista. Y esta justificación es la que justifica la campaña militar de los Estados Unidos en el Caribe, donde al menos han sido bombardeadas 30 embarcaciones, produciendo en el espacio de 4 meses más de 120 muertes. Es bajo esta categoría también de narcoterrorismo que 252 venezolanos fueron encarcelados y trasladados a las cárceles, al SECOT, a la cárcel en El Salvador. Y todos sabemos que gracias a organizaciones como Cristosal y Human Rights Watch, sabemos que estas personas han sido víctimas de torturas, abusos sexuales. Creo que una línea importante de investigación es pensar en esta espectacularidad de esta violencia. ¿Qué significa esta teatralización de la crueldad? Y creo que una categoría como pedagogía de la crueldad de Rita Segato, que viene de los estudios feministas, la podemos traer para pensar las relaciones norte y sur en este contexto de esta recuperación o de este fortalecimiento de esta ambición imperial. Creo que hay elementos que hay que detenernos a pensar como esta teatralización de la crueldad, por ejemplo, que llega al paroxismo en esas escenas de la secretaria de Defensa, la secretaria del Departamento de Seguridad Nacional, Kristi Noem, cuando va al SECOT y vemos esas imágenes o ese mensaje grabado para los migrantes advirtiendo lo que les puede suceder si se atreven a cruzar para los Estados Unidos. Hay una serie de preguntas en términos de género. ¿Qué significa este contrapunto de cuerpos de esta mujer con estos signos de lujo, un Rolex de $10,000, con una vestimenta donde impone un cuerpo frente a los cuerpos de hombres con cabezas rapadas, hombres adelgazados, hombres detenidos tras rejas? Y creo que hay que pensar nuevas preguntas con respecto a género, con respecto a cómo se están reconfigurando los grupos criminales en el Caribe y en América Latina a partir de estas invasiones. Otro grupo de preguntas, y es mi segundo punto, tiene que ver, por supuesto, con todo el campo de investigación que ha abierto los conceptos como pluralismo violento. Y que ha abierto ya una importante literatura, conceptos fundamentales como gobernanzas criminales, zona gris de la política, y un campo muy fecundo sobre los pactos políticos criminales, ¿no? Creo que una agenda que hay que explorar es este concepto y aquí está Ben Lessing, y Desmond, por supuesto, y Javier, y todos que han sido, autores y pensadores que han abierto muchas líneas, pensar las gobernanzas criminales y pactos políticos criminales en contextos autoritarios. Por ejemplo, ¿qué significan las gobernanzas criminales en países como Nicaragua, El Salvador, Venezuela? En el caso de Venezuela, los pactos políticos criminales entre el gobierno de Maduro y las bandas criminales fueron públicos y de nuevo y visibles. Entonces allí hay como lugar para pensar quizás una transición entre las zonas grises o estos pactos un poco en la clandestinidad, de la que nos hablaba Desmond, con la función de significado y el mensaje de estos pactos explícitos, visibles, estas dominaciones brutales en contextos autoritarios. Ese es otro grupo de preguntas, porque hay una reflexión, por supuesto, muy importante de estas zonas grises de criminalidad, aquí está Guillermo, que fueron pensadas en el autoritarismo en el siglo XX, por ejemplo, en México. Pero hay que repensar estas formas de relación en los nuevos autoritarismos en la región. Y eso es como un grupo de preguntas que me parece muy importante. Otro grupo de preguntas tiene que ver con género y la presencia de mujeres en contextos de gobernanza criminal. Hay una riquísima reflexión e investigación sobre gobernanzas criminales, pero las mujeres están invisibilizadas. Entonces, ¿dónde se hallan las mujeres? Sabemos que las mujeres son mediadoras entre los actores criminales y las comunidades. Sabemos que las mujeres son activistas en la distribución de servicios en las comunidades, son muy activas. Entonces creo que hay un lugar muy importante para incluir y pensar en las mujeres en, en contextos de gobernanza criminal. Las mujeres son mediadoras, son madres de los actores armados. Y cerraría con una última reflexión que tiene que ver con el tema de las responsabilidades y estos asuntos y el asunto ético vinculado a la investigación en estos terrenos. Creo que hay una reflexión del sociólogo francés Didier Fassin que es muy importante para ayudarnos a pensar. Y él habla de la etnografía pública, entendiendo la etnografía y su publicación, no solamente como la voluntad de traducir nuestras investigaciones a un lenguaje destinado a una mayor audiencia, a unas audiencias más amplias, pero también la politización de nuestras investigaciones en el sentido de la polis, de abrir debates, de cómo nuestras investigaciones pueden contribuir a generar debates, pero también a enriquecer las políticas públicas. Cerraría diciendo que hay un campo también muy fértil que tiene que ver con la justicia transicional y tiene que ver también con el último libro de Guillermo Trejo, Lucía Tiscornia y Juan Albarracín. Lo acabo de leer y lo acabo de comenzar. Y que tiene que ver con esta politización de los actores armados y cómo pensar justicia transicional para poder migrar hacia democracias menos violentas y reparar el daño producto de esta violencia, pero también la colusión de actores armados y actores estatales. Y lo dejaría aquí en los 10 minutos.
Muchísimas gracias, Verónica. Desmond.
Muchísimas gracias. I'm going to speak in English. Forgive me. I want to thank Juan Pablo and Max Cameron for the invitation to be on this panel and for organizing a panel on such an important topic here. 16 years ago, Daniel Goldstein and I published a chapter entitled Violent Pluralism in an edited volume entitled Violent Democracies. In that chapter, we made two arguments that I wanted to consider here today and think about the implications of 16 years on. First, we argued that the theory of democracy, that a lot of the transitions literature and a lot of the scholarship on Latin America has been using was flawed in the sense that it saw democracy as fundamentally opposed to rights. Democracy is fundamentally opposed to violence, right? Democracy is about getting the troops back in the barracks, stopping violence in society. And one of the things that we argued in this essay was that democracy itself was based on different types of violences, right? That democracy was based on certain types of exclusions and abuses and oppressions that instantiated violences within societies, right? And in this context, right, I'm not just talking about Latin America, but I wanted to call to mind the United States, right, where the original Constitution has the Three-Fifths Compromise that made slaves 3/5 of a human being, right? It had slavery, it had various other exclusions, right? So these are exclusions that exist not just in the United States democracy, but in democracies around the world. Understanding those exclusions, we argue, is critical to understanding democracy. Moreover, if we accept hegemonic ideas of democracy, right, that they don't have these exclusions, right, that they aren't violent, right, or they are opposed to more violent types of regimes, that they are the antithesis of more violent types of regimes, we fail to perceive the way in which violence is implicated in those regimes and the sources of contradictions within those regimes and reasons why these regimes lose legitimacy among large portions of the population that don't fully benefit from them and that find those regimes, despite their being democratic, oppressive. Even as we, as scholars, find democratic regimes generally to be better regimes for us to be in, because we can come and speak publicly and talk about them and criticize them. A lot of the people who may live in a lot of these regimes may experience them in much more different ways, depending on that regime. In this context, we came to our second argument, right, which was the notion of violent pluralism, which is that regimes within Latin America are plurally violent, right? To understand the regimes that emerged in the post-authoritarian period, right, was not to understand them as non-violent, but to understand them as differently violent from the regimes that had preceded them. So the troops may have been, generally speaking, back in the barracks. There may not have been centralized violence ordering that the opposition be repressed, or that universities be shut down, or that student mobilizers be arrested, but rather violence became pluralized and held in the hands of varied different actors across society, including the military or police, right, and police operating both licitly and illicitly within society, but also paramilitaries, gunmen, gangs, organized crime, other types of groups across society, right? And so these are other critical ways of understanding not just the ways in which oppression or exclusions exist in democracy, but the mechanisms of how contemporary Latin American democracies exist. It's important to note that there have always been plural violences in Latin American societies, as is the case in many other societies around the world. And Latin Americans have done a great job of kind of, in recent years, recovering this, right? So Jo Marie Burt and I, in an issue of Lasso Forum, published some articles where certain Brazilian scholars were recovering kind of the history of plural violence during the dictatorship. You can also read Kleber Mendonça Filho's The Secret Agent as a way of recovering that history of pluralized violence during the dictatorship, right? It's ultimately about gunmen going and killing a dissident. Colombia has, despite the fact that it's gone through two different democratic regimes over the past 60 years, Colombia has, during this entire period of time, been a violent pluralism. And violent pluralism is, of course, not limited to democracy. I see Venezuela as an authoritarian violent pluralism, and it's also important to keep that in mind. It's important to keep in mind that there are important overlaps between democracy and authoritarianism, and that while we treat democracy and authoritarianism as fundamentally different, they can be similar in varied ways, right? And democracy can be experienced by many people at the local level in particular communities as authoritarian and repressive in many ways. And it's important to keep that in mind. These twin issues that we identified have led Latin American political systems to having a growing lack of credibility. And this isn't because the systems are, as some democracy scholars have said, they're inefficacious at providing security or the public goods that society wants, but they fail to live up to their ideals. They are disjunctive, as James Holston and Teresa Caldera said many years ago, because they espouse values, but also embrace contradictions, persistent contradictions and exclusions and oppressions that lead to these systems not working for large portions of the population, right? So in this context, when you have an authoritarian moment, right, or you face an authoritarian critique or a would-be authoritarian who styles him or herself as a populist, right? What they have to offer is very compelling to people because they don't necessarily see the value in democracy, because they're not benefiting from democracy in the way that the democratic regime says that it should be valued. But they are part of persistent exclusions that are built into the underlying compromises that brought that democracy into being, right? So not only I talked about the 3/5 compromise in the US a few minutes ago, right? But if we think about the transitology literature back in the 1980s, right, there were explicit decisions made in that literature to say, hey, we're not going to mess with the capitalists. We're not going to mess with private markets. We're going to embrace global trade as part of this. Right? And those are some of the foundational decisions these regimes were based on, right, that downstream generate exclusions that promote violence, promote repression of large portions of the population, and create a situation where a lot of people in those societies don't have as much commitment to those systems as we would necessarily expect them to. But that's not because those systems are failing. They're succeeding on their own terms, right? These compromises are part of how these systems got here and why they exist. It's been said, right? Churchill did say, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, right? But not all democracies are equal, right? And all democracies have flaws, and we need to be open to understanding the nature of those flaws, those exclusions and those contradictions, to escape the paradoxes that open spaces for would-be authoritarians, that open spaces for authoritarian critiques. These experiences vary in critical ways by country, right? So if I want to talk about the nature of exclusion, violence, and violent pluralism in Brazil, it's one story about urban areas and gangs and prisons in those countries, right? If I want to talk about those dynamics in a place like Colombia, it's a history of revolutionary violence pursuing land reform and the response of landowners in the creation of guerrillas and paramilitaries, right? And the way in which all of this was dynamized and dynamized many other countries through the explosion of the global cocaine trade. If I talk about Mexico, it's some of the legacies of the way in which plural violence was used during the PRI period, right? And the explosion of the cocaine trade and the way in which that's all come together in the contemporary democracy, right? But there are particular local histories of exclusions, right, and contradictions, and the types of organizations and spaces and actors that are part of that process in each country that are particular and that exist across time and form part of both democratic and authoritarian regimes in those countries' histories. And it's important to understand that, which brings me to my conclusion, which is what are three things we should be thinking about in the future of the study of violent democracies and in democratization studies. First, I think that we as scholars have critical jobs to play in identifying what's being excluded, in identifying the contradictions of democracy. We have a role to play in saying, look, this is what we're missing. These people are being oppressed. We say this is a democracy, but these are authoritarian spaces in these democracies. Identify this and call this out. I am ashamed to say that in the United States today, the Trump administration is shutting down the ability of the academy to do this by closing down departments and closing down opportunities to identify exclusions and contradictions in the US system. We need to resist this. As scholars here, both as Latin Americanists and for those of us who are in countries like the United States that are going through some type of authoritarian retrocession in our own countries too. Second, I would say that we need to identify the often violent mechanisms that oppress us, that oppress people, and that are at the heart of democratic violences. We need to understand the police violence, the gangs. We need to understand the localized structures that create authoritarian processes and dynamics in the places where people live, in their communities, right? And we need to be able to detail these and identify these, right? So understanding those mechanisms, getting out of more strictly institutional approaches to democracy is, I think, essential. Finally, I would say we need to break with some of the transnational theoretical approach to understanding democracy, whether we talk about it as third waves or transitology or theories of retrocession. I think all of those have made important contributions, and we're going to continue to draw on them. But understanding violence, and here I go to Juan Pablo's thematic introduction that asks us to think about the lived experience of violence, I think calls us to a phenomenology of democracy. It calls us to looking at democracy in a bottom-up context, looking at it through communities, looking at the ways in which communities, cities, localities, regions may or may not be democratic, how it's experienced by people in those places, and how in those contexts, and how those contexts evolve, both in the context of particular places, but in countries in general. Be it Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, El Salvador, Chile. All of these countries have their own experiences with these evolving exclusions, both in authoritarian contexts and in democratic contexts. They transcend particular regimes. And understanding the ways in which these exclusions and contradictions transcend regimes provides us with the opportunity of both identifying them and finding ways of responding to them. Thank you very much.
Shannon.
I have just a few slides here that are largely maps, so I'm coming over here as well. Javier, thank you so much, Juan Pablo, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here. I've been coming to LASA since 1991 or so, and so it's just thank you to the organization for providing this beautiful interdisciplinary space for us year after year. In the LASA Forum dossier on violent democracies, the lead authors challenge scholars to distinguish criminal violence from structural and political violence, and then see how they work together. The research that I've been doing with Guillermo Trejo, Sandra Ley, and more recently, Natan Skigan, sheds light on the ways that criminal, state, and structural violence have reinforced one another in Guerrero, Mexico, and the ways that indigenous peoples have resisted these forms of violence and provided a viable alternative to them. So I'm going to try to explore some of the challenges and themes of this panel through a very localized experience. First, let me situate our work within the larger themes of the Congress, Republic and Revolution. The Congress description includes important questions about the Republican and liberal ideals that animated the Atlantic revolutions for independence. Congress organizers asked whether it is still possible to build what Guillermo O'Donnell called citizen democracies. Can liberalism's deep commitment to individual autonomy, they ask, be retained and even embraced and enhanced with participatory innovations? The work that I'll briefly talk about today suggests that there are examples of democracies where citizens participate robustly in their own governance. These are not liberal democracies in terms of individual autonomy. Rather, I would add an additional ism to the list of those taken up by LASA Forum this year: communitarianism. Communitarianism is a key contribution that indigenous peoples in the Americas have made to conversations about social organization and governance. Communitarianism is different from republicanism, although they share some points of contact. Both highlight the importance of an active citizen and civic participation in one's community. Both are skeptical of top-down rule and underscore the importance of citizen-led governance. But communitarianism goes deeper into the relationship between self and society. For communitarians, individuals are embedded in social and political communities of shared norms, practices, and obligations. Several million indigenous peoples in the Americas are embedded in self-governance institutions, which overlap in different ways with state or ordinary institutions. I'm thinking about the Mesoamerican cargo system and village-level autonomy community assemblies, the Minca and Ayu systems of communal labor and governance in the Andean region. In a world with so many seemingly intractable governance issues, I want to suggest that we should put all possible isms and alternatives on the table. Liberalism may not be the best or only choice for many communities. Communitarianism isn't either. However, taking up the challenge of this Congress in recognizing the need for more active forms of citizenship to combat and challenge these violent democracies that my colleagues have been talking about and that you all know about, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about one particular case study, the Coordinadora Regional de Autoridades Comunitarias, or the CRAC-PC, in Guerrero, Mexico. And here's a map here. The red dots represent the founding municipalities in the CRAC-PC system. In Guerrero's Montaña and Costa Chica region, eastern region, polycentric forms of governance are the norm. Ordinary or state police and justice systems overlap and coexist with indigenous community police and justice institutions. Polycentric governance is not unique to Eastern Guerrero. These are regions where different governance systems coexist and where citizens can choose among overlapping competencies. My current work with Trejo and Skegan focuses on indigenous policing and justice institutions as an alternative to state policing and courts. And here, this is a kind of schematic chart here that looks at the two systems kind of side by side, the community police and justice institutions, as well as the state or ordinary ones. How have indigenous institutions of community policing and justice managed to survive and, of course, evolve? For Native peoples, the liberal and Republican ideals of independence movements did not result in liberation, but forms of internal colonialism. As the Congress program notes, at the heart of the Atlantic revolutions is the idea that citizens, regardless of race, creed, gender, or nation, possess inalienable rights. Yet we know that these ideally colorblind representative institutions and republics were, from their founding, based on hierarchical notions of race and gender and representative of the few. The community self-governance institutions within which the CRAC-PC are embedded are part of this rich history of resistance to the internal colonialism of the Mexican state. And this really gets at some of what Desmond was talking about, of the very violence that's embedded in state processes and in democracy itself. The state of Guerrero has historically been one of Mexico's most violent. It was home to rural insurgencies of the 1960s and 70s and numerous occupations by the Mexican army. Today, there are more than 200 active non-state armed organizations. Socio-development indicators are among the lowest in Mexico. Yet CRAC-PC communities have sustained a low violence equilibrium. Homicide rates are a fraction of what they are in Western Guerrero and lower than in so-called safe zones in Mexico. Just put up here a slide that gives a sense of that in terms of homicide rates, percentage of municipalities with at least one armed group present, and attacks on political officials. This is the puzzle at the heart of our research question. To what institutions do ordinary citizens attribute this low violence equilibrium in Eastern Guerrero? To community self-governance institutions of the CRAC-PC or to ordinary institutions? In a 2024 survey of almost 600 citizens of Eastern Guerrero, we found that trust in the CRAC-PC, police and justice institutions, was significantly higher than trust in state-led police and courts. Why is this? When we presented citizens with alternative police profiles, citizens valued police who were insiders and who rotated. That is to say, they were not permanent, professionalized police. The CRAC-PC system of community policing rests on the election of fellow citizens to serve as justice and police officials for 2 or 3 years and then return to their communities. What can the CRAC-PC teach us? Are there any lessons for non-Indigenous Mexico, Latin America, and the global North? I'd like to close with 2 insights from this work that I think are really relevant to this panel. The first has to do with citizen participation. There is a difference between participatory innovations of the type that may reinvigorate liberal democracies and robust citizen participation. This is not community policing via more police foot patrols and occasional meetings between the police and neighbors. This is much more robust. How do we bring communities back into community policing? How do we bring communities back into the democracies that we want and desire? Our research suggests that citizens take great pride in the grassroots design of their policing and justice system and in participating in it. The rotation of police appears to be crucial to its success, alongside robust participation and community control. If we are interested in boosting perceptions of efficacy and legitimacy among citizens, robust participation appears to be key, especially when rooted in institutional design. As many of our colleagues who study societal accountability have suggested, and many of you are among those here, Participatory institutions are most effective when they emerge from below rather than being imposed from above. And finally, on police professionalization, having more professional and well-armed police may not be the silver bullet that many policymakers and citizens assume. How do we integrate mechanisms of rotation, citizen participation, and accountability into our police systems? While governments and citizens in the Americas have favored the militarization of public security to fight crime, our study reveals that a poorly armed, untrained, and rotating community police force can be seen as an effective alternative to prevent the encroachment of powerful criminal actors. So to conclude, the Croque Paissé is a rich example of communitarianism in action. Indigenous citizens are embedded in social institutions of their own design. They participate in it, they rotate out of it, and hold each other accountable in active community assemblies. Perhaps these mechanisms of rotation, participation, and accountability can be scaled up to promote more active and more citizen-focused democracies of the type that Guillermo O'Donnell had in mind. Thank you.
Oh, how do I click? Oh, with this? Thank you. Since nobody said this, I'm going to say it. It's very intimidating to be up here. Between the lights, the amount of people, and all the faces of experts who know way more about what I'm about to say, had I known this, I wouldn't be here. I'm a terrible, terrible public speaker, so bear with me. Since I'm an ethnographer, I'm going to start with a story from the field. I first encountered the term narcopolicía nearly 20 years ago while I was conducting ethnographic fieldwork in the southern conurbano bonaerense in Argentina. At the time, my research focused on the dynamics of interpersonal violence in highly marginalized neighborhoods. Again and again in interviews, in casual conversations, in community meetings, residents told me or told stories that pointed in the same direction. The police were not simply absent or ineffective, but they were actively implicated in the local drug economy. People said, sometimes cautiously, other times bluntly, that the cops were with the dealers, that officers were arreglados, that they were quite simply in cahoots with those they were supposed to police. These claims were not framed as revelations. They were shared as common knowledge. What troubled me most, however, was not only the alleged corruption itself, but how this perceived betrayal, the betrayal of what is right, shaped everyday life, how it eroded trust, reconfigured residents' understandings of authority and justice, and most important for me, how it actually shaped the course of violence within the community. Now then, somehow by chance, back then, I gained access to a court case that included wiretapped conversations between police officers and drug dealers operating in the very same neighborhood where I was doing fieldwork. And a new dimension of my research opened up, the one that ultimately led to this book that is coming out at the end of the year. And it's my first non-ethnographic book, so please be nice, okay? So, narcopolicías in conurbano, paramilitaries in Colombia, vigilantes in the US-Mexico border, los Chone killers in Ecuador, the MS-13 in El Salvador, colectivos in Venezuela, dons in Jamaica, the Zetas in Mexico, los monos in Rosario. I know some of you are cringing just for putting these names on the same list, but think about what, other than being violent specialists, that is, people who control means of inflicting damage on persons and objects, what do they have in common? All these groups, widely different in size, geographic scope, resources, and internal coherence, have clandestine, illicit relationship with state actors through which they exchange money, information, guns, and drugs. These links serve to exert power over people and places. That is, they do governance. Dark governance is a form of rule that emerges out of maneuvers and arrangements that are often obscure and obscure. Now, we know around the world, state authorities, criminal groups, semi-legal violence specialists frequently establish clandestine relationships. These are particularly consequential for understanding and explaining collective violence, from food and ethnic riots, violent partisan politics, armed insurgencies, and underground markets. But I believe, and this is responding to the first question that Juan Pablo asked us, what should we be doing? It's not in my disposition to tell anybody what they should be doing. I failed with my two sons, so I'm not going to try it here. But I think we have yet to adequately describe and theorize the role of these relationships in the larger project of governance and the mechanisms underpinning it, and how, and if they, suffocate democratic politics. Just a simple definition of dark governance: it happens when power is exerted over people and or places through clandestine relationships between state actors and criminal groups and or violent specialists who are at the edge of legality. The notion borrows shamelessly, I would say, from Desmond Arias' concept of tier and collaborative governance, and also from Nick Barnes' notion of criminal politics. It also seeks to extend their work by examining more the micro mechanisms at play. So we find these clandestine relationships. Is this? Yes. We find these surreptitious connections in political fields, as when clandestine relationships serve to finance electoral campaigns, mobilize voters, launder money, crush collective protest, surveil, intimidate, or physically eliminate political opponents and social activists. We find them in markets of criminalized drugs, as with clandestine relations serve to buy, transport drugs, supply drug dealers with key material and symbolic resources, from legal tender to guns, ammunition, information for their business, and physically remove competitors. We find them in urban space, as when clandestine relations serve to administer public safety, regulate, either reduce or increment petty crime and interpersonal violence, evict informal vendors to accommodate infrastructural renewal projects, distribute public goods, resolve disputes, informally tax residents. We find them in rural territories, as when clandestine relationships serve to displace peasants to make room for large-scale development projects or new extractive industries. Shoot out for Alex Diamond's new book, Governing the Excluded, which is precisely about this. We find them in transnational spaces, as when clandestine relationships serve to regulate migration flows. The recent work of Luigi Achilli in the Mediterranean, how brokers participate in shipping migrants from Libya to Greece, is particularly illustrative in this regard. So insofar as they impose rules and restrictions on the behavior of others, residents of marginalized communities, peasants, activists, migrants, traffickers, clandestine relationships do governance. Given that these relationships are secret or illicit, we can call them a form of dark governance. Now, clandestine connections might indeed weaken the rule of law, and by extension, democracy, but paradoxically, they might also fortify governance capacities. Rather than weakening the state, as in many of the arguments that I myself had made that examine the corrupted influence of drug trafficking, illicit links between official authorities and criminal actors can strengthen certain hands of the state. Again, from the work of Desmond Arias, we know a lot about the social, economic, and political factors shaping the formation and transformation of micro-level armed regimes. Going granular on dark governance, we can unearth actually the mechanisms that sustain clandestine relationships, mechanisms such as the breakup of negotiations, through which we have spikes of violence, the foundational negotiations through which these clandestine relationships are actually established, brokering, trust building, identity boundary blurring, as when people become narcopolicías or polinarcos. But we can also learn about the micro-sociological paths connecting collusion, for example, and violence. And let me give you just two examples of what I have in mind. What does it look like going granular on dark governance? This is a police officer. This is my, what someone would call a data set, but I wouldn't dare call it a data set. These are all the wiretap transcripts I found through clandestine connections too. But this is a police officer talking with the head of a drug dealing group in the province of Neuquén. He says, when I need something from you, you're always there. This is mutual. We're here for one another. Another officer informs the main dealer about an imminent federal investigation on his network and adds, I tell you this because we're friends. Sos sangre de mi sangre. Because oftentimes you help me and now I want to help you. Tellingly, in referring to the officers with whom they're colluding, the narcopolicías, the main dealer and his associate, or trafficker and his associates, use the language of kinship. In many a phone conversation, he reminds his closest associate that it was Sunday, time to pay our relatives. Now, this shows that trust building is a key mechanism in the daily makings of dark governance. Now, we do know as ethnographers, and Dennis Rogers is somewhere here, I know, because he told me he was going to come, and if I don't cite his work, he's going to be mad. There you are. But we know that neighborhood, friendship, and family networks are central in the recruitment of street dealers and in the operation of drug business. They know each other, they trust each other. What I didn't know is that friendship, kinship, and neighborhood ties also link individuals engaged in criminal activities with members of the security forces. They are primos, they are tíos. In other words, cops and dealers are oftentimes neighbors, friends, and relatives. These ongoing, concrete relationships between traffickers and state officers are responsible for producing much of the trust needed in illicit practices and in dark governance. So I think, again, I don't want to prescribe anything, but I do think that we need to think about dark governance not as a set of isolated actions, but as what Norbert Elias used to call a figuration. In other words, a web of social and political relationships in which a key defining feature is a constantly fluctuating balance of power. So when we talk about dark governance, I'm pointing about something very specific, a subterranean line of action running through contemporary political life. It's not random. It emerges out of recurrent relationships that over time follow certain regularities. They form a pattern that is coherent and intelligible, and even if it's always improvised and always, at least from the transcript I read, about to collapse, and always locally negotiated. Let me give you just one more example. This is about a court case, a wiretap call, a police officer, boom, quietly warns a trafficker. Looks like they're about to raid your place. Clean house, wipe your phones. This is the state telling the traffickers what to do. A single line, but it reveals an entire, always working, always about to collapse world. And crucially, I think we can see dark governance. It becomes visible when we track the concrete, intentional decisions made by real actors on the ground. Politicians, bureaucrats, police officers, traffickers, gang members, all of them all the time calculating, negotiating, plotting, pursuing strategies, or pursuing advantages, one would say. But, and I think this is the key point, the larger consequences of this, very intentional, very localized, are never centrally directed. In other words, I think, based on the evidence I have, that dark governance is a strategy without a strategist. Now, let me now conclude with the question that Juan Pablo asked me, what are the implications for democracy? Diana Salazar Mendez, who was the Ecuadorian Attorney General for the Metastasis case, which was a case that dissected the connections between state actors in Ecuador and drug and arms traffickers Leandro El Patron Norero, coined the term, I think she coined the term, judicial penal paradises, to refer to the geographical regions where criminal behavior goes unpunished due to the complicity of judges and members of security forces. The term hints at the main conditions of possibility of dark governance, which is widespread impunity and lack of accountability. Now, democratic fortitude suppresses dark governance, besieging and choking the environment in which clandestine relationships can proliferate. But the opposite is also true. The relationship between democratic capacity and dark governance is a recursive one. Clandestine relations rupture the boundaries within which this type of political regime is supposed to operate. There cannot be free, fair, competitive elections, even for the minimalist definition of democracy. There are no real guarantees for human and civil rights, and institutional checks and balances break down. In other words, dark governance suffocates democratic politics. Now, let me now conclude with a slightly hopeful note, because we all need it, just wishful thinking, but it's not wishful thinking. In Reversible Destiny, the study of the Palermitan Mafia, Jane and Peter Schneider describe the intreccio, this intertwining between mafiosi and organized crime and the state. And they examine the genesis and relative success of the anti-mafia movement, the way in which joint, sustained, and organized both capillarily and publicly, collective action may thwart brutal force. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, it suffered many drawbacks. Yes, it was risky, but they show that collective action actually worked. And it worked in part because it managed to transcend deep, well-established ideological divisions, in their case, between Christian Democrats and communists. When civil society actors, neighborhood groups, grassroots organizations, and larger social movements establish working relationships between pieces of the state, the fight against state crime, clandestine relationships, can actually be impactful. So if we are to confront this thing we call dark governance, we should all learn from those Italian activists, state officials, and citizens who jointly fought against the intreccio. I think they show us a way out. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a los cuatro. En honor al tiempo y a abrir la discusión con la audiencia, les voy a pedir que reduzcamos a 2 minutos la interacción de la mesa. Lo siento, pero la democracia violenta no fue muy eficiente. Entonces les pido simplemente que digan lo que quieran decir en 2 minutos en relación a lo que han escuchado, en relación a cosas que les quedaron pendientes, y luego abrimos a preguntas de la audiencia.
Bien, bueno, en 2 minutos, muy rápidamente. Creo que un comentario de Desmond sobre esta experiencia que están viviendo en Estados Unidos sobre este autoritarismo y esta intervención en las universidades, creo que eso da pie para pensar formas de intercambio todavía más acentuadas entre académicos latinoamericanos que tenemos experiencia navegando, resistiendo y lidiando con los autoritarismos, lo que está sucediendo en Argentina, pero que ya ha sucedido en Venezuela, en Nicaragua, en Cuba. Creo que hay líneas importantes de colaboración que hay que subrayar todavía. Otra línea de comentarios, por supuesto, vinculada al concepto de dark governance, es si hay lugar para pensar una zona negra de estas colusiones, cuando en contextos autoritarios hay colusiones visibles entre los actores políticos y los agentes estatales y los actores criminales, con una función performativa de expresar formas de dominación y control de la población más explícitas en contextos autoritarios. Por ejemplo, igual el trabajo de Dennis Rogers ha sido importante para mostrar cómo en Nicaragua Nicaragua no es ese caso excepcional y el caso el trabajo de Maya Colombón también. Nicaragua no es solo esa experiencia de policías comunitarias que tienen este legado de la revolución, sino que es un caso donde también hay pactos y colusiones más explícitas entre agentes estatales y actores criminales o miembros del narcotráfico. Y por último, creo que hay un tema que no hemos hablado, pero que también es importante, y es pensar la mano dura en contextos autoritarios. Es decir, todos hemos investigado y trabajado sobre el concepto de mano dura y cómo la mano dura en El Salvador produjo, y los trabajos de José Miguel Cruz han sido también muy importantes, cómo produjeron esta mutación en las maras de ser gangs territoriales y barriales a constituirse en redes criminales. Ese es el caso también en Venezuela del Tren de Aragua. Pero la mano dura en contexto autoritario como en El Salvador o como en Venezuela pareciera que va un paso más allá y tiene una vinculación muy directa con la necropolítica. ¿no? Por ejemplo, en Venezuela, la mano dura se tradujo en ir un paso más allá del encarcelamiento masivo a la matanza sistemática. En El Salvador, estamos apenas comenzando a presenciar cómo este encarcelamiento masivo comienza, a pesar de la opacidad, a vislumbrarse y a visibilizarse muertes perpetradas dentro de la cárcel. El grupo de expertos internacionales han visibilizado al menos 500 muertes y 519 desapariciones forzadas. Entonces sí, como esta invitación a pensar la mano dura en contextos autoritarios y ese paso más allá en términos de la opresión y la violencia letal.
Muchas gracias.
I don't have a lot to add at this juncture. I liked Shannon examining trans-regime histories of exclusion, and I think that that's something we need to consider across societies, right? How these regimes of exclusion exist apart from political regimes, right? And crossing across political regimes. I would say that reflecting on Javier's presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading his book soon, I think it's really important when we talk about criminals being friends with police, right, which is very much something that's real, right? It certainly exists in other societies. There are very permissive boundaries between guerrillas, paramilitaries, and the state. In Colombia, Mexico has, these boundaries are transgressed between police and criminal organizations all the time, quite famously at times. I think this goes back, to me, this connects back to the broader point that there aren't differences, that the rigid line between the licit and the illicit doesn't really exist, right? It's all part of the same thing, and that we need to understand crime, violence, oppression, exclusion as parts of wider systems as part of wider systems, polities, and markets, right? And we don't need to see them necessarily as opposed to them, but as part of them. And that while they are pernicious, right, and may do things like suffocate democracy, right, we have to understand how as part of these systems, how these negative effects can be overcome, but not denying them and saying, no, this isn't part of it. Because to the extent that we say that's not part of it, and I think that this vignette really brings to light in really interesting ways how it's part of it. By saying it's not part of it, we lose the sense of how these systems of oppression, exclusion become part of democracy, right? And I guess the last thing I would say is I think we need to take seriously understanding the similarities between authoritarian and democratic systems.
Thanks. Shannon?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really struck by the focus on the local and on lived experience. I think Desmond started off by talking about the importance of thinking theoretically as well about even our definitions of what violent democracies are, more from a lived experience, because as economists are often critiqued for focusing only on the macroeconomy, but people's microeconomies don't seem to jibe at all with that. Similarly, in political science, it's like, yeah, we have all these really great technical and nifty techniques to measure democracy, and they're really important, and yet they often don't seem to jibe with reality. So we have to find a way of I think coming to terms with that. I think focusing on lived experience and even the local focus of criminality, which is really what Javier was talking about. So I was struck by that, the local networks in the dark governance. I think that leads us naturally to a focus on the kind of methodologies that we use when we're studying violent democracies. And it seems to me that there are a whole range of folks here that talk a lot about participatory methods and the importance of collaboration and agenda setting with folks on the ground, collaborators. And there are also people that are maybe not doing that kind of participatory work, but working with victims, working in defense of human rights. So using their work as a way of defending human rights, which I think is different than participatory methods, but I think important and complementary in many ways, a kind of more public policy focus. And then that tension between focusing on victims, focusing on those that have been excluded, but then not limiting their identities to being victims or being excluded, and trying to shed light or maybe just diffuse, open up opportunities to share experiences where people are living dignified lives. They're living out democracies in many different ways. Maybe not the democracies that our techniques measure very well, but they're experimenting and they're innovating, and it's neat to be able to talk about those as well as all of the dark stuff.
I agree. No, but I should have mentioned this. I just finished reading Angela Garcia's latest book, The Way That Leads Among the Lost, which is on the Anexos, on rehab centers in Mexico City. And it's a fabulous book. I super recommend it to anybody. But as I was reading it, I kept thinking, and I'm glad, now we're putting the lived experience of people, because this is what we do, ethnographers. This is what our trade, right? Like that's, we need more ethnography. But I've always been interested in how all these mega concepts, the gray zone, violent pluralism, how they actually shape micro level interactions within a house, within a home, within the neighborhood. And it's easy to invoke connections, micro, macro. Another thing is to actually show them. And I think, and again, I don't want to be saying this is what we should be doing. It's not, again, in my disposition, but I think there's a whole, and Angela Garcia shows us a way in which we can do it productively, that it's very promising. In fact, I started working on dark governance because I saw the very limitations of the idea of the gray zone many years ago, that it didn't go granular enough. And I think we need that granularity to really understand how it actually shapes people's lives. Anyway.
Gracias, Javier. Gracias a todos y todas. Tenemos unos minutos para preguntas de la audiencia. Les pedimos que sean breves, que se presenten antes de hablar y que si se van y salen, por favor, cierren la puerta al salir. Gracias. Ustedes, preguntas, comentarios. ¿Ven? Vamos a juntar preguntas y luego, si es posible, le damos un minuto más a los panelistas para que respondan.
Yeah. Ben Lessing, University of Chicago. I want to thank this fabulous panel for bringing together these panelists and these ideas that you've brought to the table. I think it was really enlightening. I want to just, to me, something that flowed from everybody's comments, right, is the expansion of the criminal realm. You could have been talking about violent democracies 40 years ago, but they wouldn't have been all about crime. And why is that, right? Well, there's many reasons. There's not a single cause. But I just think that the prohibition and repression of the drug trade has vastly expanded the criminal realm. I just think that's beyond doubt. And so it has made what would have been in another time, perhaps, pluralisms that involved, as you mentioned, rural armed actors, other kinds of armed actors. Now they're criminal armed actors. Multiple shared forms of governance are now dark governance, right? And so I think the criminalization of plural governance, or the criminalization of these other realms, and I think we can think systemically, not in a kind of like, no overbearing way and overgeneralize, but I think we can think systemically about how that affects things. And something Veronica said also, struck me. It's true, when we talk about criminal governance, we often don't talk about the roles of gender. But the criminalization of governance, and criminal groups actually a lot of times are pretty conservative. Right, so thinking about criminal governance as a force for conservatism. It sounds strange because they sell drugs, but in terms of gender roles, they're often extremely conservative, right? Or LGBTQ issues and things like that. So as you criminalize these realms, it can also be a force for exclusions of different types. And I also would just echo Desmond that the criminalization is itself a kind of exclusion, right? It's excluding drugs from the illicit economy. It's darkening this whole realm of human activity, of economic activity. It's making illicit an enormous flow of money around the world. So I just think that's an interesting lens to put the contributions in.
Hola, Pablo Andrade, Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. lindo panel, lo he disfrutado, pero hay un punto que han dejado fuera y es la transmisión intergeneracional de violencia. Hay gente que nace en la violencia y que vive toda su vida en la violencia, un poco lo que decía Desmond. Pero creo que además eso es más claro ahora, es más fuerte ahora y creo que necesitamos pensarlo.
Buenas tardes, Armando Castiblanco, Universidad Externada de Colombia. Mi pregunta es, ¿ustedes aún reivindican la noción de Estado como categoría analítica o la consideran en cambio, en transformación?
¿Alguna otra pregunta, comentario, reacción? Adelante. Sí, aquí adelante.
Buenas tardes, Diego Flores, Universidad de Ottawa, en Canadá. Yo soy parte de un equipo de investigación que se llama el Observatorio de Criminalización, Violencia y Democracia, y nosotros vemos la criminalización, pero en relación con los defensores de derechos humanos. Yo estoy muy interesado en la criminalización contra defensores de la tierra, en particular del agua, indígenas en México. Un tema que me encanta mucho, entonces muchas gracias por eso. No sé si ustedes, pues, esta discusión que nos dieron, muy excelente, pero siento que hizo falta esa parte de los grassroots movements, de la gente de abajo, de cómo es que estas personas que defienden los derechos, cómo es que son afectadas en estas democracias violentas que vivimos. Nosotros definimos la criminalización como una herramienta que países democráticos usan mucho más como una forma de silence this dissent comparado a otras tácticas más violentas que incluso sí existen hoy, pero no sé si ustedes tendrían comentarios sobre esto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Hay otra pregunta allá atrás, sí.
Muchas gracias. Soy Daniel Duarte de Chile. Un factor común que se vio en las presentaciones es el rol de la comunidad o las prácticas comunitarias como una manera de, digamos, de cuidar, digamos, enfrentarse a la violencia. Y hay lugares en América Latina donde estas prácticas son, digamos, están muy presentes, pero al mismo tiempo hay un contexto social, cultural que está como más bien yendo en contra de lo comunitario, en temas de fuerzas económicas, culturales. ¿Cómo ven, digamos, ustedes eso y cómo se puede contrarrestar si se ve que la comunidad tiene, o las prácticas comunitarias tienen este rol tan relevante?
I'm Pedro from Cambridge. My question is, how would we research or make sense of the fact that many people who are often at the intersections of these plural violences often see in further uses of violence a way out of the situation? If you take, for example, the big police massacre that happened in Rio a couple of months ago, the approval rates for the operation were highest in the community that received it. And this is often the case in these situations, that those who are there know that the police is corrupt, that they don't trust the police at all, they don't trust the organized criminal groups, but the solution that they see for it is often a further demand of violence. How do we make sense of that? And how, and particularly with the link with democracy, that then if they were to vote, they would vote in favor of probably further of those actions. So with a connection with democracy there.
Gracias. Última pregunta ahí. Sí.
I'm Luis from Brazil, São Paulo. How do you all evaluate the idea that in our liberal democracies, the separation between state and crime generally doesn't exist, the government is synonymous with crime, especially when you look at the financial market. The case of Banco Master in Brazil, now the fraud of Banco Master, a democracy in a casino world where rulers defraud investments and deal with governments like gamblers, highlighting monopolies, highlighting investor, bank frauds, etc.
Muchas gracias. Yo voy a tomarme el privilegio de hacer una última provocación y luego les doy la palabra para que cierren 2 minutos cada uno. A mí me gustaría tomar un poco el espíritu de la intervención de Desmond en decir, bueno, ¿cuál es el rol que estamos teniendo en el debate público? ¿Sí? Y creo que parte, digamos, con lo que tenemos que lidiar lo muestra bien el caso de Bukele, que está, digamos, aquí entre nosotros, aunque no lo hayamos nombrado tan directamente. Verónica hablaba de la espectacularidad de la violencia, de la teatralización de la crueldad, pero también hay que entender que eso gana elecciones, ¿no? Y gana elecciones en el contexto actual. Y eso puede ser por lo que Desmond denominaba algo así como la falta de credibilidad de la democracia, ¿no? y de lo que nosotros concebimos como democracia desde nuestras categorías académicas. Cómo esas categorías tienen una falta de verosimilitud con lo que la gente vive en su contexto cotidiano, con lo que mucha gente y muchos latinoamericanos experimentan en su vida cotidiana. Lo mismo aplica a lo que Javier planteaba respecto al Estado, ¿no? y al orden legítimo, ¿no? Esta forma clandestina oscura de generar eventualmente orden legítimo en estas sociedades que no cuadra con las nociones de Estado desde las cuales nosotros articulamos nuestro trabajo teórico y empírico, ¿no? Y creo que tampoco hemos sido capaces, digamos, como comunidad académica, de levantar alternativas creíbles a lo que se ha vuelto en la región un commodity, que es la buquelización de nuestra política y nuestras democracias, ¿no? Y ahí me parece que el trabajo de Shannon y colegas puede aportar luces en términos de pensar de otra manera y tensionar la noción de democracia liberal que ponemos siempre por delante de todo lo que estamos pensando y investigando, con justa razón, pero tal vez con poco sentido de realidad. Y también me gustaría, en términos de estas alternativas, porque tensiona mucho, digamos, lo que normativamente, digamos, lo que estamos viviendo y lo que eventualmente pueden ser alternativas, recomendarles el artículo en el fórum de Angélica Durán Martínez sobre pactos con accountability democrático, ¿no? Que creo que es algo que tenemos que empezar a discutir, nos guste o no nos guste, en el contexto que vive la región. Les dejo 2 minutos cada uno, estamos justo para terminar.
Sí.
Solo una historia. Hace 4 años me invitaron a Medellín, en la Universidad de Antioquia, a dar un taller de etnografía. Y al final, como parte de la agenda que crean cuando uno va a Medellín, que es una agenda de 27 horas cuando uno tiene 24 horas, pero estaba muy ocupada y me querían llevar a la Comuna 8 a que vea unos proyectos comunitarios. Entonces, claro, yo me acercaba a la comunidad y estaba pensando dónde están los actores armados, dónde están lo que eran los punteros peronistas, dónde está todo lo malo. Y los chicos que me estaban llevando, creo que Irene anda por ahí, me decían, mira, acá va a ir la biblioteca, mira, aquí va a ir el jardín agroecológico, mira, acá hay un grupo de jóvenes que está trabajando con temas de violencia de género. Me estaban dirigiendo la mirada hacia lo que estamos trabajando ahora con un grupo de colegas que le decimos Things That Work, ¿no? Pero no por populismo, por romanticismo, porque, bueno, no todo está tan mal, sino porque Italo Calvino decía al final de Ciudades Invisibles que tenemos la obligación de buscar en un mundo que es un infierno, de buscar no infiernos. Me parece que no solo por nuestra propia salud, digamos, sino porque me parece que tienen un montón de cosas que enseñarnos sobre los mecanismos y los procesos que pueden sostener a la acción colectiva. No porque nos hagan sentir bien, sino porque podemos aprender de lo que hace a la acción colectiva eficaz, ¿sí? Y lo otro que quiero decir sobre el tema de la violencia que señalaba el compañero ahí, creo que es todo un desafío intelectual, si se quiere, empezar a ver a la violencia a veces como un acto ético. Yo he entrevistado y he jangueado con muchos padres que usan la violencia contra sus hijos porque tienen miedo que caigan en el narco. ¿Sí? Yo sé que es complicado decir, y complicado hacer el argumento, en público sobre todo, de que a los márgenes la violencia se usa como un comportamiento ético. Pero cuando el Estado ha traicionado lo que es lo correcto, cuando la única herramienta que uno tiene es encadenar a la hija para que no caiga, digamos, no tengo una reacción moral contra las drogas, digo, pero desde su punto de vista es caer. Ahí el uso de la violencia, y ahí rescato otra vez el trabajo de Ángela García, porque ella habla de los anexos justamente con esa ambigüedad que tiene la violencia. ¿Sí? Eso nada más.
Quizá nada más también contestar un poco esta pregunta del compañero brasilero. No hay que romantizar el rol de la comunidad tampoco, ¿verdad? Las comunidades son conservadores, las comunidades quieren la violencia, etcétera. Yo creo que lo fundamental es el control social. ¿Qué tanto control comunitario, control social hay en la comunidad? Es decir, hay una gran diferencia entre las autodefensas en México y la policía comunitaria. Y yo creo que esta diferencia tiene que ver principalmente con el control social. Entonces, hay comunidad y hay comunidad, ¿no? Quizá por último, muchos de los problemas que nos están causando violencias de múltiples en nuestras sociedades tienen que ver con esta burocratización de la vida, ¿no? No hay control social dentro de nuestras mismas universidades, ¿no? Entonces, para luchar en cada espacio para este control que requiere participación robusta de parte de todos nosotros en nuestros espacios también, ¿no? No hay que siempre estar culpando a estas entidades así como de arriba. Cada espacio yo creo que va a requerir mucho más de nosotros si queremos construir las democracias que decimos que queremos.
Bien, bueno, dos breves comentarios. Uno es el de género y la transmisión intergeneracional de la violencia. Lo que creo interesante de traer género a la conversación sobre crimen es comprender también de una manera relacional estas masculinidades y feminidades y cómo contribuyen a conformar los órdenes territoriales armados y cotidianos, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, hay unas masculinidades muy conservadoras, pero por otro lado hay una construcción de las mujeres también en la literatura como si solo fueran víctimas. Y cuando uno está haciendo trabajo de campo, bueno, las mujeres participan de maneras muy diversas en el control, pero también en la producción y reproducción de la violencia. Por ejemplo, trabajando en comunidades en Caracas, bueno, si por un lado las madres fueron capaces de negociar un pacto de cese al fuego con las bandas armadas y lograron un cese al fuego, por otro lado, esa transmisión intergeneracional de los relatos de asesinatos recíprocos entre las comunidades es lo que paradójicamente contribuye a la reproducción de las violencias, porque los jóvenes son socializados con que en el otro vecindario enemigo, allí está el que mató a tu hermano. Entonces, cómo las mujeres participan en esa reproducción de la violencia y en ese control de la violencia. Igual las figuras maternas, por ejemplo, las madres por ejemplo, la madre de un jefe del tráfico de drogas. Entonces, bueno, ella se beneficia y tiene privilegios por ser la madre y cómo ella capitaliza esa posicionalidad para regular la violencia en su entorno, ¿no? Entonces, complejizar la figura de las mujeres. Creo que pensando en la cuestión del crimen y cómo el crimen ha venido en los sectores populares, canalizando el descontento y las ambiciones de movilidad social, creo que un gran desafío es traer la política de nuevo a la vida comunitaria y a la vida social. Es decir, que este oficio de cómo hacemos para convivir siendo diferentes, ¿no? Es decir, hay como una degradación de las democracias y Juan Pablo habla de democracias muertas, pero cómo hacemos para repolitizar y la política entendida como esto que nos hace humanos, ¿no? Con el uso de la palabra. Cuando vemos estas operaciones en Río de Janeiro, donde en un evento mataron a 130 personas y lo peor es de nuevo este espectáculo de los cadáveres reunidos y que cuenta con aprobación, bueno, cómo desafiamos y cómo a través de la politización podemos contrarrestar desde una minoría, creo, pero cómo podemos contrarrestar estas imágenes, estos discursos.
Thank you. There are too many questions that were really awesome that I can answer in 2 minutes. So I will focus on this question about Rio and the massacre there, and I think the related provocation of Juan Pablo's about Bukele and support for Bukele and how this works. So I would first say that if we talk about Rio's favelas, they're heterogeneous places. Not everybody who experiences the oppression of drug gangs necessarily welcomes further police violence and abuse. Some of them welcome certain types of police intervention. And some of those people who welcome further types of police intervention also are strongly supportive of democracy, of Lula. Others are not, right? These are complicated places and complicated communities within an even broader and more complicated polity, right? So I think it's first important to say that there is a great deal of diversity. But when we talk about democracy writ large, we're talking about aggregate processes, right? And how much support there really is, right? And in the event of, authoritarianization, authoritarian retrocession, how committed are people to democracy? How committed are people to vote simply on the basis of democracy for a government that they don't feel is really necessarily meeting their needs? As happened back in the United States in 2024, right? People were not willing to vote for Kamala Harris simply on the issue of democracy when they were frustrated with other economic questions. And the frustrations of people living in Rio's favelas under drug trafficking and police abuse, I think, are much higher than those of most American voters. But beyond that, there is this real experience of people experiencing oppression in these communities, right? And what we, right, and this is what I'd like to close with, what we need to identify as scholars is what are the sources of these contradictions and oppressions in our areas of study or in the countries we live in, right? How are they rooted in particular historical experiences? And in what ways are these parts of compromises and contradictions that democracies are based on? And one of the key things we can do as scholars who care about democracy, and care about living in open societies and less oppressive societies is identifying these contradictions, calling out these problems that are parts of democracy, that are parts of compromises and parts of flaws in democracy, so that we can be the ones to do it rather than would-be authoritarians who want to overthrow democracy, right? So there's a critical role that we have to play in identifying these problems, bringing them to light and saying, look, there are problems with democracy. There are oppressions. There are localized authoritarians. There are regionalized or nationalized authoritarianisms that are going on. And these are the ways we need to think about resolving this, by addressing these types of historic trans-regime exclusions that continue to be parts of democracy, right? And argue and push for ways of resolving these contradictions in order to make open, positive societies that respect human rights more viable and resilient in the future. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Solo tenemos tiempo para seguir aplaudiendo y agradecerle al panel. Gracias a todos y sigan disfrutando el lazo.
What is LASA? LASA is hard to define. We create an event. And I think the part of what makes LASA an event is this momentary meeting of a plural and diverse collection of incredible scholars and practitioners and students. And when we come together at a particular time or place to reflect, to debate, it shapes our identity, it shapes our position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We often say that it's more than an annual conference, and it is. It encompasses the Latin American Research Review, LASA Press, the LASA Forum, the Latin American Cultural Center, the Regional Symposia. It hosts book fairs, film festivals, and film series. It presents awards and prizes.
There is no other place on the planet, Earth, where you can feel intellectually as comfortable as in the Latin American Studies Association.
Pensar LASA en estos 60 años es pensar en una comunidad que no deja de producir ideas, debates y vínculos que cruzan países y generaciones. En estos últimos 10 años crecimos mucho en escala y en alcance, y mi trabajo y el del secretariado fue ayudar a que esa energía se traduzca en capacidad real, equipos, procesos y estructura para que las iniciativas de las y los presidentes, el Consejo Ejecutivo, las secciones y los miembros se conviertan en realidad.
LASA always coincides with events in the world that challenge us.
Casi 2 semanas después de las elecciones presidenciales.
As an association, we form witness to wars, civil and international, to dictatorships, complicated political transitions, polarization, ecological crises, shifts in global power. But LASA has always remained a plural space in which rigorous scholarship and civic engagement go hand in hand. It's a voice for our community, offering advocacy and the defense of research and teaching. A source of our professional identity, an ongoing invitation to deepen our knowledge and awareness of the complexities of the world, of other people, of ourselves. I guess above all, it's a community. Although it's just a moment, it defines us. And I think we come away reoriented, reshaped. Maybe we are actually sort of confirmed in our mature judgments. Maybe we're challenged by some of the things that we've heard. Whatever the case may be, there's a kind of a magic in our coming together in all of our diversity and complexity. LASA gives us endless opportunities to practice dialogue, mutual respect, and collaboration. Together we can be more creative and more courageous. LASA is a home in the world with many rooms and many windows, and I hope everyone can find a place in it. Looking ahead, our challenge is clear: to strengthen LASA as a principled, strong, thoughtful, and plural voice, defending academic freedom and civic engagement, even in times of crisis, of polarization, and democratic backsliding, when finding agreement can be difficult.
Y hacia adelante, el desafío es claro: sostener esa potencia con estabilidad y recursos y seguir siendo un espacio plural, global y vivo.
Como encontrar una familia desperdigada por el mundo. Yo pienso que le toma el pulso a lo que se está cocinando, a lo que está sucediendo. I think it really functions as an intellectual community. That's very important.
De alguna forma entablar diálogo intergeneracional, y de eso también enriquece los estudios y el campo.
It's nice that there's a lot more research related to activism and the internet and technology.
activistas, conocedores, intelectuales indígenas, en donde pues se puedan poner estos conocimientos en diálogo.
What I've most liked is actually the film festival, the series of...
And if your field is Latin America, you are a Latin Americanist and you are welcome in the Latin American Studies Association.
Siempre aprendo algo nuevo en los congresos, pero también en el proceso.
Colaboraciones y solidaridades denso.
A commitment to social transformation, social justice, intellectual expression, and academic freedom, and that we will always be monitoring and being vigilant on those fronts, because if not, there would be no loss.
Hoy más que nunca deben de conducirse a la construcción de otros mundos posibles.
LASA must continue to be a strong, thoughtful, principled, and plural voice, defending academic freedom, promoting diversity, and linking research to action.